You ever seen a bullet outrun doubt? The voice cut low across the firing range just seconds after the distant steel rang out, a hollow metallic echo traveling back over nearly 4,000 yards of shimmering heat, snapping every head toward the horizon as laughter died mid-breath and boots shifted against the gravel. Marines frozen in place with rifles half lowered, eyes narrowing against the glare, searching for something that shouldn't have happened. Not at that distance, not with that rifle, and definitely not from him. But 10 minutes earlier the air had been different, lighter, filled with the easy arrogance of a training day gone routine. Gunnery Sergeant Kyle Mercer stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching his team struggle with a shot just beyond 1,200 yards, their high-end optics and ballistic computers feeding them clean numbers that still didn't land. Steel, frustration building, pride bruised, and then someone laughed. A sharp, careless sound that spread fast as eyes turned toward the edge of the range where an old man stood alone, just outside the firing line, wearing a faded field jacket and holding something that didn't belong, a rifle bright orange against the muted tones of sand and steel, its color almost offensive under the desert sun, like a signal flare in a place built on discipline and control. Mercer squinted, taking a few steps closer, boots crunching slow and deliberate, his shadow stretching long across the dust until it stopped just short of the man. "You lost, sir?" he asked, the word "sir" carrying none of its usual respect, just formality stripped to bone. The old man didn't answer right away, his pale blue eyes fixed somewhere beyond the target line, not on the Marines, not on Mercer, but on the invisible movement between them, the wind shifting in layers most couldn't see, his posture calm, almost detached, like he was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Mercer followed his gaze, saw nothing but heat waves dancing off the ground, then looked back at the rifle, that bright, out-of-place orange, and let out a quiet chuckle that didn't stay quiet for long. "That thing a toy?" he said, louder now, enough for the others to hear. A few Marines snickered, tension breaking into mockery as they gathered closer, circling just enough to make it clear he didn't belong there. The old man finally shifted his grip, not defensive, not reactive, just adjusting the balance like it was second nature, like the weight of it meant something more than the color ever could. Mercer stepped in closer, close enough to reach out, his gloved hand brushing against the rifle's surface, tapping it lightly. "Bright choice," he added, smirking. "Easy to spot if you drop it." And for the first time, something changed, not in the old man's posture, not in his face, but in the air itself, subtle, like pressure before a storm. His eyes moved then, slowly, from the horizon back to Mercer, steady, unblinking, carrying a depth that didn't match the rest of him. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost lost in the wind. "Color helps you find it when everything else disappears." Mercer frowned, the smirk fading just a fraction, but the moment passed as quickly as it came, replaced again by confidence, by control, by the need to prove something in front of his men. "Range goes out to 4,000, he said, gesturing toward the distant steel barely visible through the shimmer. "You think that thing can even reach it?" The old man didn't answer, not right away, his eyes drifting back to the horizon, reading something none of them could see. And somewhere behind the line, Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks felt it, that shift, that quiet tension threading through the moment, something off, something wrong, like they had just stepped into a story already in motion, and they were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But no one said a word, because out there, far beyond what should have mattered, the wind changed direction, and the old man noticed the wind did not move in a straight line. It curled and folded across the range like something alive, slipping between ridges, lifting off heated rock, dropping into shallow dips that no sensor could fully map, and Daniel Hayes watched it all without blinking, his head tilted just slightly, as if listening to a distant voice. "Gunnery Sergeant." Mercer followed his gaze again, impatient now, seeing nothing but empty air and a target so far out it looked like a flaw in the horizon. "You planning to shoot or just stand there all day?" Mercer said, his tone sharpening, the Marines behind him shifting their weight, a few raising their scopes again. Curious now, but still amused, the old man lowered his eyes for a moment, not to the rifle, not to the ground, but to a patch of dust no one else paid attention to. where a faint swirl lifted and vanished almost instantly. Then he stepped forward, one slow step onto the edge of the firing line. And that alone was enough to change the mood. Boots stilled, voices dropped, because even without rank or uniform, there was something deliberate in the way he moved, something practiced. Mercer noticed it too, though he would not admit it, his jaw tightening as he stepped in closer. "This is a restricted line," he said, more forceful now. "You do not just walk up here." But Hayes did not stop. He simply rested the rifle against his shoulder, not rushed, not hesitant. The bright orange stock catching the sun in a way that made it impossible to ignore, a color that did not belong in this world of matte finishes and muted tones. And yet in his hands it looked exactly where it needed to be. Lance Corporal Brooks felt it again, that quiet shift, like the moment before a storm breaks, his eyes moving from the rifle to the old man's stance, noticing the details others missed, the way his feet aligned not with the target, but with the terrain. The way his breathing did not match the rhythm of tension around him, but something slower, steadier. Mercer scoffed, folding his arms. Again, trying to pull the moment back under his control. "You think you can hit that from here?" he asked, gesturing toward the distant steel, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The question hanging in the air like a challenge. But Hayes did not answer, not directly, his finger resting along the frame, not yet on the trigger, his eyes narrowing slightly as another gust rolled across the range. Invisible but felt in the subtle shift of heat and light. Brooks swallowed, something about this did not feel like a joke anymore. He reached for his radio without thinking, thumb hovering just above the button, unsure of what he would even say. Because how do you explain a feeling? How do you report something that has not happened yet but feels inevitable? Mercer took another step forward, closer now than before, his shadow crossing over the rifle as he leaned in. "Go ahead," he said, a half-smile returning, though thinner this time. "Show us." And for a brief second, everything went still. The wind, the voices, even the distant hum of the range seemed to fade, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And in that silence, Daniel Hayes finally placed his finger on the trigger, not with tension, not with force, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had done this long before anyone here had ever touched a rifle, and far beyond them, unseen and waiting. Something aligned the trigger broke with a softness that almost did not exist, a subtle pressure more felt than heard, and for a split second nothing changed. No recoil that drew attention, no dramatic motion, just a quiet release into the vast open distance. The rifle settling back into Daniel Hayes' shoulder like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. And the Marines watched, some expecting an immediate reaction, others already smirking again, waiting for the miss they were certain would come, because at that distance, at nearly 2.5 miles, no one here had ever seen a confirmed hit, not without his breath shallow, counting without realizing he was counting. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, the silence stretching longer than it should, long enough to feel wrong, long enough to pull every gaze back toward the horizon. And then it came, faint at first, almost imagined, a distant metallic report carried slowly across the range, a delayed echo that did not match the timing of anything they knew, but it was unmistakable. Steel struck clean and true, the sound arriving like a message from another world, and everything stopped, completely. Mercer's half-formed smirk froze in place, his eyes narrowing as his mind tried to catch up with what his ears had already confirmed. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, and Brooks felt it hit him all at once, not just the realization of the shot, but the weight of everything leading up to it, the stance, the silence, the way Hayes had read the air like it was written for him alone. His hand tightened around the radio. Now, no longer hesitating, his thumb pressing down as his voice came low and controlled, calling up the chain with words he barely processed himself, giving a name he had only just heard, describing a shot that should not exist, and somewhere far from the range, in a place where decisions carried weight beyond training exercises. A line opened, a signal flagged, a name recognized not by rank or uniform, but by something older, something buried deep in records and memory. And back on the range, Daniel Hayes remained still, his gaze drifting once more across the shifting heat, as if the shot itself was the least important part of what had just happened. as if he had only confirmed something he already knew, while behind him, the Marine stood in a silence that no command had given, a silence that came from understanding, slow and heavy, that they had just witnessed something they were never meant to underestimate again. And in the distance, beyond their sight, unseen hands were already moving in response. No one spoke after the sound reached them, not because they were ordered to be silent, but because something deeper had settled over the range, something that made words feel unnecessary. Gunnery Sergeant Mercer slowly lowered his arms, the confidence that had filled his posture moments ago now replaced with a stillness he did not fully understand, his eyes fixed on the distant target as if it might offer an explanation. But the horizon remained unchanged, shimmering under the sun, giving nothing back. Lance Corporal Brooks kept his radio close, his call already moving through channels he had never accessed before, and even without hearing the responses, he could feel the shift, the quiet urgency building somewhere far above his rank. Daniel Hayes did not look at any of them. He simply adjusted the rifle in his hands, checking it with a familiarity that came from years no one here had witnessed, his fingers moving over the bright orange surface not as something unusual, but as something worn into memory, something that had been carried longer than most of these Marines had been alive. Mercer finally took a step forward, slower this time, measured, as if approaching something he no longer fully controlled. "That was a lucky shot," he said, but the words did not carry the same weight they had before. They sounded thinner, uncertain, even to him. Hayes did not respond, not with words, not with expression, his gaze drifting once more across the terrain, tracking something invisible, and that silence pressed harder than any answer could have. Brooks watched Mercer closely now, seeing the shift, the hesitation, the beginning of understanding that pride was no longer enough to hold this moment together. A low hum broke through the stillness, faint at first, distant, but growing, a vibration more felt than heard. Several Marines turned instinctively, scanning the sky beyond the range, the sound sharpening into something recognizable, rotor blades cutting through the air, approaching fast, and that alone was enough to change everything. Mercer's head snapped toward the source, confusion replacing doubt, because this was not scheduled, not part of training, not something that just happened without reason. Brooks felt his grip tighten around the radio as a voice came through, clearer now, direct, requesting confirmation of the name he had given, repeating it with a tone that carried weight far beyond routine protocol. And when Brooks answered, steady but quiet, there was a pause on the other end, a pause that stretched just long enough to mean something. The helicopter broke over the ridgeline then, descending with controlled precision, dust lifting in slow spirals beneath it as it settled near the edge of the range. No one moved to greet it. No one gave orders. They simply watched, because whatever had just been set in motion was no longer theirs to control. The engine noise faded as the rotors slowed, and in the sudden quiet that followed, the door opened, a single figure stepping down, posture straight, presence unmistakable even at a distance. Mercer instinctively straightened, years of training taking over before thought could catch up. Brooks lowered his radio slowly, eyes fixed on the approaching officer, and Daniel Hayes finally shifted his attention, not surprised, not tense, just aware, as if this moment had been expected all along. And as the figure drew closer, the weight of rank became clear, not through insignia alone, but through the way the air itself seemed to adjust around him. And when he stopped just a few steps away, his gaze moved past everyone else, landing directly on the old man. And in that instant, the entire range seemed to understand that whatever they thought they knew about this moment was no longer enough. The officer did not rush, did not speak, and did not acknowledge anyone else. On the range as he walked forward, his boots pressing into the dust with quiet authority that needed no announcement, Gunnery Sergeant Mercer snapped fully to attention now, the reflex immediate and absolute. The Marines behind him following a half-second later, the loose formation tightening into disciplined stillness, but the officer's focus never shifted toward them. His eyes locked on Daniel Hayes with a recognition that did not need confirmation. Lance Corporal Brooks felt the weight of it. Immediately, that silent exchange between two men who did not need introductions, and it sent a chill through him that no amount of desert heat could touch. The rotor wash faded completely, leaving only the faint whisper of wind across the range, And in that stillness, the officer stopped just a few feet in front of Hayes, close enough now that the details became clear, the lines on Hayes' face, the calm in his posture, the bright orange rifle held steady at his side like it belonged in this exact moment. And then something happened that no one on that range had expected. Not Mercer, not the Marines, not even Brooks. The officer straightened slightly, his shoulders pulling back, and without a word he raised his hand in a crisp, deliberate salute. Not casual, not symbolic, but precise, exact, the kind of salute reserved for someone whose presence carried history, the kind that was not given lightly. And for a brief second, no one moved, because they were not sure they had seen it correctly. Mercer's breath caught, his mind racing to reconcile what stood in front of him, a high-ranking officer, someone whose authority defined the entire installation, saluting an old man in civilian clothes. Holding a rifle that had just been mocked minutes ago, Brooks felt his chest tighten, understanding arriving all at once, not through explanation, but through instinct. This was not recognition of a lucky shot. This was something deeper, something earned long before today. Daniel Hayes did not react immediately. He did not return the salute with urgency or surprise. Instead, he looked at the officer for a brief moment, his expression unchanged. Then slowly, deliberately, he shifted the rifle to one hand and raised his own in return, the motion smooth, practiced, carrying the weight of years that did not need to be spoken. And when their hands lowered, the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it. The officer finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying across the range with effortless clarity. "You took your time," he said, not as a reprimand, but as something closer to acknowledgement, something that implied a shared understanding beyond what anyone else could grasp. Hayes gave the smallest nod, his eyes drifting once more toward the distant target, as if confirming something only he could measure. Mercer stood frozen, the structure of his authority cracking under the realization that he had misjudged everything. Not just the man, but the moment itself, the laughter, the comments, the challenge, all of it now echoing back with a different meaning. Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, the weight of what he had witnessed settling in, knowing that this was no longer a training exercise, no longer a routine day on the range. This was a line drawn between assumption and truth, and everyone standing there had just crossed it without realizing. The officer turned slightly then, his attention finally shifting toward Mercer and the Marines, his expression neutral, but his presence alone enough to command absolute focus. And though he had not raised his voice, though he had not given a direct order, the message was already clear. Everything that had happened before this moment had been seen, understood, and remembered. The officer's gaze lingered on Mercer for a moment longer than necessary, not with anger, not with visible judgment, but with a quiet weight that settled deeper than any shouted command ever could. And when he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, controlled, yet unmistakably firm. "Stand down," he said, not loudly, but with a tone that carried absolute authority. Mercer responded instantly, "Yes, sir." The words sharp, reflexive, but beneath them something had shifted, something uncertain. The Marines behind him followed suit, their posture rigid, their eyes forward, though none of them could ignore the presence of the man standing just a few feet away holding that bright rifle. The officer turned back to Hayes, the tension easing slightly from his shoulders, replaced by something closer to respect than formality. "We were not expecting you today," he said, and there was something in the phrasing that suggested this was not a casual visit, not a coincidence. Hayes adjusted his grip on the rifle, the orange surface catching a softer light now as the sun dipped slightly, his voice low but steady when he replied, "I was not planning to be here." And that answer seemed to carry more meaning than the words themselves. The officer gave a small nod, as if that was enough, as if no further explanation was required. "Lance Corporal." Brooks watched closely, trying to understand the exchange, every word, every pause, feeling like he was witnessing something that existed outside the normal chain of command, something built on history rather than rank. The wind shifted again, a gentle cross-current brushing across the range, and Hayes glanced toward it instinctively, the same way he had before the shot, and the officer noticed, his eyes following the movement for just a second before returning to Hayes. "Still reading it the same way," he said quietly, almost to himself. Hayes did not respond, but there was the faintest change in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite acknowledgement, just something that suggested the statement was accurate. Mercer remained still, but his mind was no longer on protocol. It was racing backward through every moment that had led here. The laughter, the comments, the challenge he had thrown out without understanding who he was speaking to, and now standing in front of him was a man who had just been saluted by a senior officer without hesitation. Without question, Brooks felt it too. That realization settling heavier with each passing second. The idea that the story they thought they were part of had been something entirely different from the start. The officer took a step back then, just enough to widen the space between them, and turned slightly toward the range, his voice carrying again, "Clear the line," he said, simple, direct, and immediately obeyed. Marines, moving without hesitation, stepping back from the firing positions, creating space not just out of discipline, but out of something closer to respect now. Something unspoken but understood. Hayes remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply standing at the edge of the line as if that was where he had always been meant to stand. Brooks lowered his radio completely now, no longer waiting for instructions, because whatever was happening here had already moved beyond anything he could influence. The officer looked once more at Hayes, his expression steady, measured, and then asked a question that seemed simple on the surface but carried a deeper weight beneath it. "Do you want to finish?" And for a brief moment, the range held its breath again, not because of the question itself, but because of what it implied, that what they had just seen was not the end, not even close. And Hayes, without hurry, without hesitation, shifted the rifle slightly in his hands and looked back out across the distance. Where the wind continued to move in patterns only, he seemed to understand Hayes did not answer the question with words. He simply stepped forward again, one measured movement that carried more certainty than any spoken reply. The rifle rising back into position with a familiarity that made it feel less like an action and more like a continuation of something already in motion. The Marines watched from behind the cleared line, no longer whispering, no longer shifting, every eye locked onto the old man, as if the distance between them and the target had somehow shortened, as if what he saw out there mattered more than anything they had been trained to trust: gunnery. Sergeant Mercer stood rigid among them, but his focus had changed completely, the earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more attentive, as if he was trying to learn without admitting it. Lance Corporal Brooks felt his heartbeat slow, not from calm, but from concentration, the kind that pulls everything inward, narrowing the world down to one moment, one action, one outcome. Hayes adjusted his stance slightly, a fraction of an inch at most, his boots pressing into the ground as he aligned himself not just with the target, but with the terrain between, the invisible path the bullet would travel. The wind moved again, soft but layered, brushing across the range in overlapping currents that shifted direction with distance. And Hayes tracked it all without lifting his gaze, his breathing steady, controlled, matching something deeper than rhythm, something internal. The officer remained just off to the side, silent now, watching not as a superior, but as someone who understood exactly what was about to happen and did not need to interrupt it. The bright orange rifle settled against Hayes' shoulder once more, its color no longer out of place, no longer something to mock, but something that had become part of the moment itself. Brooks noticed the way Hayes' finger rested again along the frame, not yet on the trigger, waiting, not for silence, not for permission, but for alignment, for that precise instant when everything between here and 4,000 yards out would fall into place. Mercer swallowed, the sound small but sharp in the stillness, his eyes flicking briefly toward the distant steel, then back to Hayes, as if trying to measure something that could not be calculated. Seconds passed, though they did not feel like seconds. They stretched, layered, folding into the quiet pressure building across the range. And then, almost imperceptibly, Hayes exhaled, a slow release that seemed to carry the entire moment with it. His finger moved, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with that same quiet certainty, the trigger breaking clean beneath it, the sound of the shot sharp but controlled, cutting through the air without echo. And once again, Hayes did not move after. He held the position for just a fraction longer, then lowered the rifle slightly, as if the outcome had already been decided the moment he committed to the shot. Brooks counted again without realizing it. 1 second, 2, 3. The silence deeper this time. Heavier, because now they understood what they were waiting for. And when the distant steel answered, the sound arriving across the miles with that same delayed certainty, it did not surprise them, not in the way the first one had, but it still struck just as hard, because it confirmed something none of them could ignore anymore. This was not luck. This was not chance. This was precision beyond their understanding. Mercer closed his eyes for a brief moment, just long enough to reset something inside himself. And when he opened them again, the way he looked at Hayes had changed completely, not as a stranger, not as a civilian, but as something else entirely, something that did not need to prove anything to anyone. And as the echo of the second impact faded into the distance, the entire range stood in a silence that no longer felt uncertain, but absolute. No one reacted when the second impact echoed back across the range. Not because it was insignificant, but because it confirmed something they were still trying to process, something that had already shifted the ground beneath their assumptions. Gunnery Sergeant Mercer slowly exhaled, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have, his eyes still fixed on the distant steel, as if expecting it to move again, to prove that what they had just witnessed was real, but it remained still now, silent. Its purpose already fulfilled. Lance Corporal Brooks lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when experience collides with something greater than training, something that cannot be taught through manuals or simulations. Daniel Hayes eased the rifle down fully this time, the bright orange surface no longer drawing attention for its color, but for what it had just done, his hands steady, his posture unchanged, as if this moment carried no weight for him at all. The officer stepped forward again, closing the distance by a single step, his presence quiet but undeniable. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone now, not authority, not command, but something closer to respect acknowledged openly. They needed to see that, he said, not looking at the Marines, not addressing anyone but Hayes. And for a brief moment, the words seemed to settle over the entire range. Hayes gave a slight nod, his eyes still scanning the terrain as if the lesson extended beyond the shot itself. Mercer finally shifted his stance, not breaking discipline, but adjusting in a way that acknowledged a change he could not ignore. His gaze moved from the target back to Hayes, and for the first time, there was no challenge in it, no trace of earlier doubt, only a quiet understanding that he had been standing on the wrong side of something far larger than himself. Brooks felt it ripple through the line behind him. Marines who had laughed minutes ago now standing completely still, their attention fixed not on the distance, but on the man who had bridged it with nothing more than instinct and precision. The officer turned slightly then, his attention expanding outward, taking in the entire formation, and though his expression remained controlled, there was a clarity in his voice when he spoke next. "What you witnessed today is not equipment," he said, his words measured, deliberate. "It is not luck, and it is not theory." He paused briefly, letting the silence hold the weight of what followed. "It is experience earned over time you cannot replicate." No one responded. No one needed to. The truth of it was already evident in the stillness around them. Hayes adjusted the rifle once more, not preparing to fire again, but settling it as if the moment had reached its natural end, his gaze finally leaving the horizon to rest briefly on the Marines, not judgmental, not distant, but steady, the kind of look that did not demand respect, but carried it nonetheless. Mercer straightened fully again, but this time it was not reflex, it was intentional, his voice low when he finally spoke. "Sir," he said, addressing Hayes directly, the word now carrying the respect it had lacked before. Hayes did not respond with words, only a slight inclination of his head, enough to acknowledge, not enough to elevate. The officer watched this exchange quietly, then gave a small nod of his own, as if confirming that what needed to happen had already happened, and as the last traces of sound faded from the range, what remained was not the memory of the shots, but the silence that followed them, a silence filled not with confusion, but with understanding that would not be easily forgotten. The wind moved. Softer now, no longer shifting in sharp currents, but settling into a quiet rhythm that stretched across the range, carrying with it the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Daniel Hayes turned slightly away from the firing line, the rifle resting easily in his hands as if it had completed its purpose for the day. Gunnery Sergeant Mercer remained at attention, but the tension in his posture had changed. No longer rigid with control, but grounded in something steadier, something earned in. The silence that followed understanding. Lance Corporal Brooks watched as Hayes began to step back from the line, not hurried, not lingering, just moving with the same quiet certainty that had defined every action. Before, the officer stood where he was, observing, allowing the moment to settle fully before speaking again. "You will remember this," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the formation, not as a command, but as a statement, something meant to stay long after the dust had settled. Mercer responded first, his voice clear. "Yes, sir." But this time it was not just acknowledgement of rank, it was agreement. Brooks felt it too, the shift from routine to something permanent, something that would not fade with the end of the day. Hayes paused for a brief moment, just at the edge of the cleared line, his gaze lifting once more toward the distant horizon, not measuring, not calculating, just looking, as if confirming that the range, the wind, the distance had all returned to what they were before. Then he lowered his eyes and continued walking, the bright orange rifle catching the light one last time before it turned away from the line of sight. Mercer watched him go, not with curiosity anymore, but with a quiet respect that needed no words. Brooks lowered his head slightly, a small gesture that mirrored the understanding settling across the entire group. The officer finally turned back toward them, his presence steady, his expression composed, but there was a finality in his voice when he spoke. "Some skills are not taught," he said, pausing just long enough for the meaning to settle. "They are lived." No one moved, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to add. The lesson had already been delivered, not through instruction, not through repetition, but through a moment that could not be replicated. And as the helicopter's rotors began to turn again in the distance, slow at first, then building into a steady rhythm, the sound blended with the wind, carrying the moment away without diminishing it. Mercer relaxed his stance just enough to breathe again. But the way he looked out across the range had changed, no longer searching for confirmation, but holding on to what he had seen. Brooks lifted his radio once more, not to call, but to secure it. The need for communication replaced by clarity, and far beyond them, the steel target stood silent, unchanged, yet somehow marked by what had reached it, a distance that now meant something different to every person who had witnessed it. And as the dust lifted gently under the rising rotor wash, the range returned to its stillness, but the silence left behind was not empty. It was filled with a truth that would remain long after the sound of the shots had faded. A truth that did not need to be spoken again because it had already been understood by all who stood there.